People think the cold only steals warmth, but sometimes it steals the life you were supposed to have until a stranger decides you deserve another sunrise. I never imagined that one decision on the coldest night of my life would rewrite everything I believed about fear, kindness, and destiny. My name is Emily Carter, and last December, when the temperature dropped to 12 degrees and the wind swept through our little town in upstate New York like it was searching for every crack in every home, I stayed late at the historic library where I restored damaged books for a living. Most people hurried home before the storm reached its worst, but old pages couldn't protect themselves, and neither could the memories they carried. By the time I locked the front door, snow had already buried the sidewalks beneath several inches of white, and the streetlights glowed through the swirling flakes like distant stars. My little blue sedan struggled through the icy roads, the heater barely keeping up with the freezing air creeping through the worn weather seals around the windows. I remember gripping the steering wheel with stiff fingers, wondering whether my furnace at home would survive another brutal winter night. Life had never been glamorous. I lived alone in the small farmhouse my grandmother left me outside town, a place with creaky floors, squeaky pipes, and a front porch that always leaned a little farther each year. Still, it was home. It was warm enough. Most nights, anyway. As I turned onto the narrow county road leading toward my house, my headlights swept across endless fields buried beneath untouched snow. Everything looked peaceful until I noticed something lying near the old oak tree beside my mailbox. At first, I thought it was a fallen branch covered by drifting snow. Then I saw it move. My heartbeat stumbled. I slowed the car until it rolled to a stop, staring through the windshield while the windshield wipers struggled to clear the heavy flakes. Every sensible thought told me to keep driving. People always warn you never to stop on an empty road at night, but something about the shape on the ground refused to let me leave. I grabbed my flashlight, wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck, and stepped into the freezing wind. The cold hit like a wall, stealing my breath before I reached him. He was a man, tall even while collapsed against the frozen earth, dressed in black clothes dusted with snow. His dark coat looked expensive despite the ice clinging to it. His face was pale from the cold, his dark hair damp with melting flakes, and faint lines of intricate tattoos disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt before vanishing beneath his sleeves. Even through heavy gloves, I could feel how cold his hand had become when I gently checked for a pulse. It was there, weak, but steady enough to give me hope. His breathing was shallow, and his eyelids barely moved when I softly called out, asking if he could hear me. He never answered. I searched for a wallet, a phone, anything that could tell me who he was or who to call, but found nothing except a simple black ring tucked inside one coat pocket. No identification, no keys, no explanation, just a stranger freezing in the middle of nowhere while the storm grew stronger by the minute. I looked back toward my house, its porch light glowing faintly through the snow less than 200 feet away. Calling an ambulance would take time because the roads were becoming nearly impossible to drive. Leaving him there wasn't something I could live with. Somehow, with more determination than strength, I managed to help him into the passenger seat of my car. His head rested against the window as warm air slowly filled the cabin, but he never opened his eyes. During the short drive to my house, I kept glancing at him, wondering what kind of man ended up alone on a frozen road wearing clothes that belonged in a luxury magazine instead of a snowstorm. I couldn't have known that before the next sunrise, my quiet little home would become the destination of hundreds of black SUVs, and the stranger sleeping beneath my roof would reveal a world I never believed existed. The moment I guided him inside, the silence of my little farmhouse felt strangely different, as if the walls themselves understood that a stranger had crossed the threshold carrying a story much heavier than the snow resting on his shoulders. I locked the front door against the howling wind and helped him onto the old couch that had belonged to my grandparents for more than 30 years. The fireplace had nearly burned out, so I quickly added another log and watched the flames slowly return to life. Warm light danced across his face, revealing sharp features that looked impossibly calm despite the exhaustion written into every breath. I found dry blankets in the hallway closet, carefully wrapped them around his shoulders, and placed a mug of warm broth on the coffee table even though I doubted he could drink it. His hands were still ice cold. The tattoos stretching from beneath his collar across his neck disappeared beneath the sleeves of his shirt, Intricate black designs that looked less like decoration and more like chapters of a life I could never imagine. They should have frightened me, but they did not. What unsettled me was how someone who looked so composed could end up alone on an empty road in the middle of a blizzard. I checked his temperature with the old thermometer from my medicine cabinet. It was low enough to worry me, but not low enough to panic. I called the local emergency clinic, but every line was overwhelmed because of the storm. The recorded message explained that ambulances were delayed and asked people to shelter safely unless someone stopped breathing. I looked back at the stranger. His breathing remained slow but steady. There was nothing left to do except wait. Hours passed while snow piled higher against the windows. I sat in the rocking chair across from the couch pretending to read a novel, but my eyes drifted toward him every few minutes. Around 2 in the morning, he finally stirred. His eyelids opened just enough to reveal striking green eyes that scanned the room with remarkable awareness despite his obvious weakness. He noticed the fire first, then the blankets, then me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked in a quiet, steady voice, "Where am I?" I told him he was safe in my home and that I had found him outside, nearly frozen. He looked toward the window where snow continued to fall before closing his eyes again, as though he were measuring every word I had spoken. "You should not have stopped," he murmured. I smiled without thinking. Maybe, but I did. The corner of his mouth moved ever so slightly, not quite becoming a smile. Most people would have kept driving. I shrugged. Then I am glad I am not most people. He became silent again. A few minutes later, I offered him the warm broth. He accepted the mug with careful hands and drank only a few small sips before thanking me with unexpected politeness. His voice carried confidence, the kind that belonged to someone accustomed to making decisions instead of asking for permission. Yet there was also exhaustion hiding beneath every sentence. I asked for his name. He hesitated long enough for me to notice before answering. "Damien." Nothing more. No last name. No explanation. I respected the silence. If he wanted to tell me more, he would. Before dawn, I must have fallen asleep in the rocking chair because the sound of the front door closing woke me with a start. The couch was empty. The blankets had been folded with surprising care. The mug sat washed beside my kitchen sink. On the coffee table rested only the simple black ring I had discovered in his coat pocket and a neatly folded handwritten note. It contained just 6 words. "Thank you. You saved more than me." I hurried outside, but the driveway was empty except for fresh footprints disappearing into the white morning. The storm had finally ended, leaving the world quiet enough that I almost convinced myself the entire night had been a dream. I slipped the black ring into my coat pocket, made a cup of coffee, and prepared for another ordinary day, never imagining that within an hour my peaceful country road would no longer belong to quiet mornings, but to a procession so extraordinary that my neighbors would remember it for the rest of their lives. At exactly 9 o'clock, I was standing in my kitchen washing the empty coffee mug when a distant rumble rolled across the frozen countryside. At first, I assumed another snowplow was clearing the county road, but the sound kept growing louder until the windows began to vibrate softly inside their wooden frames. I walked onto the front porch and immediately stopped breathing for a moment. A line of black sport utility vehicles stretched as far as I could see, moving slowly through the blanket of fresh snow like a perfectly organized procession. The morning sun reflected across hundreds of polished windshields until the entire road shimmered like a river of glass. My closest neighbor stepped outside wrapped in a heavy winter coat, staring with the same disbelief painted across my face. Curtains moved all along the street as families looked outside to see what could possibly require that many vehicles. Every single one turned onto my road. Every single one stopped in front of my house. Doors opened almost at the same moment. Men dressed in tailored black suits stepped into the snow with quiet discipline, forming neat lines instead of creating chaos. None of them raised their voices. None of them looked hurried. Their calm professionalism somehow made the entire scene even more unbelievable. I stood frozen on the porch clutching my coffee mug, while dozens of respectful eyes briefly scanned the property before lowering toward the ground. Then the final vehicle stopped directly in front of my mailbox. A driver opened the rear passenger door. Expensive black shoes touched the snow first. Then the man from the night before stepped into the winter sunlight. For one impossible second, I wondered whether I had mistaken him for someone else. The exhausted stranger from my couch had disappeared completely. Damien now wore a perfectly fitted charcoal overcoat over a dark suit that looked custom-made. His posture was confident, his movements calm, and the intricate tattoos that had covered his neck the night before remained visible above his collar like part of an identity he had never tried to hide. His green eyes met mine with the same quiet focus I remembered from beside my fireplace. But this time, there was unmistakable authority behind them. The men surrounding him did not simply accompany him. They waited for every step he took as though the rhythm of their entire morning depended on his. Damien climbed the porch stairs alone, while everyone else remained exactly where they stood. He stopped several feet away from me, giving me space instead of pressure. The cold air carried the scent of pine trees and fresh snow between us. "Good morning, Emily," he said gently. Hearing my name made my heart skip. I had never told him my last name. I had barely told him anything at all. Before I could ask how he knew who I was, I noticed every person behind him standing perfectly still, watching only him and waiting silently. Damien seemed to understand my confusion. "I owe you an explanation," he said. I folded my arms against the cold, trying to hide how overwhelmed I felt. "You definitely do." A faint smile appeared for only a second. "My name is Damien Moretti." The name meant nothing to me, but the reaction around him did. Even the wind seemed quieter while he spoke. "These people work for me. They spent all night searching after we lost contact during the storm." I looked past him at the endless line of vehicles covering the road. All of this, for one person? His expression never changed. Not just one person. He looked directly into my eyes before finishing the sentence. The person responsible for every life connected to mine. I could not find the right words. I had offered a stranger a warm place to sleep because it felt like the decent thing to do. I never imagined that simple kindness had been extended to someone whose arrival could silence an entire town without a single raised voice. Damien reached into the pocket of his overcoat and slowly held out the simple black ring I had forgotten was still inside my coat. "You kept it safe," he said quietly. I removed the ring from my pocket and placed it in his hand. I thought it might belong to someone who would come looking for it. He closed his fingers around it without taking his eyes off mine. "It belonged to my father. I have carried it every day for 15 years. Something in the way he spoke made the expensive suits, the endless line of vehicles, and the silent bodyguards disappear for a moment. He no longer sounded like the powerful man standing before an army. He sounded like the exhausted stranger who had fallen asleep beside my fireplace. I folded my arms against the cold wind. "You still have not told me why all of this is necessary." Damien glanced briefly toward the road before looking back at me. "Because last night I disappeared during the storm. Hundreds of people searched until sunrise. They believed something terrible had happened." I looked at the endless line of black vehicles again and shook my head in disbelief. "For one man," he answered without hesitation. "For the man responsible for thousands of employees, hundreds of families, and every promise I have made to protect them." The words were confident, but they carried weight rather than arrogance. I realized he did not see leadership as privilege. He saw it as responsibility. He took one careful step closer, still leaving enough distance to respect my space. "Emily, I came here because there is something I need you to hear directly from me." The winter breeze swept across the porch between us, carrying tiny crystals of snow through the sunlight. Every person behind him remained perfectly silent. "Last night," he continued, "you made a decision that almost nobody else would have made. You opened your door to a complete stranger. You expected nothing in return. You did not ask my name. You did not ask what I owned. You only asked whether I was alive." I smiled awkwardly. That seemed like the important question. His expression softened in a way I had not seen before. "It was..." He paused for several seconds before continuing. "There are people who respect my position. There are people who fear my influence. There are people who admire my success. Very few simply see another human being." I looked down at the worn wooden boards of my porch. I only did what my grandmother taught me. She always said that kindness should never depend on introductions. Damien nodded slowly, as though he wanted to remember every word. One of the men standing near the first vehicle quietly approached the porch but stopped several feet away. "Sir," he said respectfully, "your next meeting has been delayed. There is no urgency." Damien acknowledged him with a slight nod, and the man immediately stepped back without another word. I blinked in surprise. Did he just delay an entire meeting because you were talking to me? Damien answered with complete honesty. Yes. I laughed nervously because it seemed impossible that someone with so much influence could stand on the porch of my old farmhouse discussing life with a book restorer. You really do not have to thank me like this, I said. A warm blanket and a bowl of broth are not worth an entire convoy. He looked directly into my eyes, and for the first time I noticed genuine gratitude replacing the careful control in his face. Emily, there are debts that money can settle. There are debts that power can solve. Then there are debts that can only be honored with respect. You reminded me that compassion still exists when nothing else can be purchased. That is not something I will ever treat as small. I did not know how to answer. The quiet life I had always understood suddenly felt much larger than the little farmhouse behind me, and I could not shake the feeling that this conversation was only the beginning of a story neither of us had expected to live. The convoy finally disappeared just before noon, leaving only tire tracks pressed into the fresh snow and dozens of unanswered questions circling through my mind. By the following Monday, I had almost convinced myself that life would quietly return to normal. The library smelled of aging paper, cedar shelves, and fresh coffee exactly as it always had. I slipped on my cotton gloves and continued repairing the cracked spine of a history book that had survived nearly a century. The slow rhythm of careful work usually settled my thoughts, but every time I reached for another page, I remembered Damien's calm voice and the gratitude in his eyes. I reminded myself that extraordinary people belonged in extraordinary worlds. Mine was built from quiet mornings, handwritten notes, and forgotten books waiting for someone to care enough to restore them. Around lunchtime, our director, Mrs. Henderson, hurried across the reading room with tears shining in her eyes. I had never seen her move that quickly. She gathered the staff together beside the front desk and held a letter so tightly that the paper trembled in her hands. I do not know how this happened, she said, struggling to catch her breath. But someone has donated enough money to keep this library open for at least another 10 years. The room fell silent before everyone erupted into relieved laughter. For months we had feared permanent closure because of budget cuts. We had held bake sales, charity events, and community fundraisers that barely covered heating costs. Suddenly, every financial problem had vanished overnight. Reporters called the donation anonymous. Even the town council admitted they did not know where the money had come from. I wanted to celebrate with everyone else. Yet something inside me quietly remembered a man who believed that debts of kindness should be answered with respect rather than money. I pushed the thought away. It could not be connected. That evening I drove to visit my mother at the rehabilitation center 40 miles away. She had spent months recovering after a difficult surgery, and every trip reminded me how expensive healing could become. When I arrived, the receptionist greeted me with an unusually bright smile. Good news, she said before I even signed the visitor log. Your mother's therapy program has been completely covered through the end of the year. I stared at her, convinced she had confused me with another family. There must be a mistake. I have not submitted any new paperwork. She checked the computer once more and gently shook her head. Everything has already been verified. The donor requested complete privacy. My heart began to beat faster. 2 miracles in 2 days felt far too unlikely to be coincidence. My mother noticed the confusion on my face the moment I entered her room. She squeezed my hand and smiled. Someone out there still believes good things happen to good people. I smiled back, but I could not stop wondering who that someone really was. A week passed without another surprise. Then one snowy evening, as I finished locking the library doors, I found a small package resting on the front steps. There was no shipping label, no company logo, and no signature. Inside rested a first edition of my favorite childhood novel, beautifully restored, along with a simple handwritten card. It contained only one sentence. Some stories deserve a second chance because someone believed they were worth saving. There was no name beneath the message, but I recognized the careful handwriting immediately. I looked across the quiet street where snow drifted beneath the glowing lamps, half expecting to see the familiar line of black vehicles waiting in silence. The road remained empty. Still, for the first time since that extraordinary morning, I realized Damien had kept his promise. He had not tried to change my life by standing in the middle of it. Instead, he had quietly strengthened the parts of my world that mattered most, leaving me to wonder whether the greatest acts of kindness were sometimes the ones nobody ever witnessed. Nearly 3 weeks passed before I saw Damien again, and during that time I almost convinced myself that whatever strange connection had formed between us belonged to one unforgettable winter morning and nothing more. Life settled back into familiar routines. I restored books during the day, visited my mother every Saturday, and spent quiet evenings reading beside the fireplace where a mysterious stranger had once slept. Yet every now and then I caught myself looking toward the road whenever I heard engines outside, wondering if another line of black vehicles would appear beyond the snow-covered trees. They never did. Then one Friday evening, everything changed. The library closed early because another winter storm was expected before sunset. I packed my bag, locked the front entrance, and started walking toward the employee parking lot behind the building. The streets were unusually quiet. Most businesses had already closed, and the sky had turned the pale gray that always arrived before heavy snowfall. As I unlocked my car, I noticed an unfamiliar dark sedan parked across the street. There was nothing unusual about the vehicle itself, but it had remained there every evening for nearly a week. I had dismissed it as coincidence until I saw another similar sedan farther down the block. Both cars pulled away the moment I looked in their direction. A chill settled over me that had nothing to do with the weather. I drove home using my usual route, but every few miles I caught glimpses of headlights that seemed to remain the same distance behind me. They never came too close. They never tried to pass. They were simply there. By the time I reached my farmhouse, the headlights disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. I stood on my porch staring into the dark road for several minutes before going inside, telling myself I was imagining things. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson called while I was making breakfast. Her normally cheerful voice sounded uneasy. She explained that two well-dressed men had visited the library asking polite but unusually specific questions about me. They wanted to know my work schedule, whether I lived alone, and which days I visited my mother. They claimed they represented a charitable foundation interested in supporting local preservation projects, but something about the conversation had made her uncomfortable. She refused to answer any personal questions. After hanging up, I tried to convince myself there had to be a harmless explanation. Even so, I locked every window before leaving for the rehabilitation center. Snow drifted gently across the highway as I drove, but halfway there my phone rang through the hands-free system. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. I almost ignored it before curiosity won. "Emily," the calm voice said the moment I answered. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. "Damien, please do exactly what I ask," he said, his tone steady but more serious than I had ever heard before. "Continue driving to the next public rest area. Do not stop anywhere else." My heart began racing. "What is happening?" There was a brief pause before he answered. "Someone has become interested in the woman who helped me during the storm. I will not allow your kindness to become your burden." I looked into the rearview mirror and noticed a familiar dark sedan several car lengths behind me. Another traveled ahead in the right lane. My pulse quickened, but Damien's voice remained remarkably calm. "You are not in immediate danger," he continued. "I have people nearby. I simply want you somewhere safe while I handle the misunderstanding." 10 minutes later, I pulled into the brightly lit rest area exactly as he instructed. Before I even shifted into park, several black sport utility vehicles quietly entered from different directions and positioned themselves throughout the parking lot. Nothing about their movements appeared hurried or aggressive. They blended naturally among the other travelers while creating an invisible circle of reassurance around my little car. Moments later, Damien stepped out of one of the vehicles wearing a dark wool coat dusted with fresh snow. He walked toward me alone, his expression composed, but when our eyes met I saw something I had not seen before. For the first time since we met, the confident man who always seemed prepared for everything looked genuinely worried, not for himself, but for me. Damien stopped beside my driver's side window and waited until I unlocked the door before speaking again. Snowflakes settled across the shoulders of his dark coat, melting almost instantly as he leaned down just enough for me to hear him without raising his voice. "You are safe now," he said. "I am sorry you were pulled into this." I stepped out of the car, wrapping my winter coat tighter against the cold. "You keep saying that, but nobody will tell me what is actually happening." He looked toward the distant highway for a brief moment before meeting my eyes again. "There are people who believe every relationship can become an advantage. They noticed that someone outside my world mattered enough for me to return here." I folded my arms, more frustrated than frightened. I am a librarian who repairs old books. There is nothing extraordinary about me. A faint smile crossed his face despite the seriousness surrounding us. That is exactly what makes you extraordinary. Before I could answer, a light cough interrupted him. He turned slightly away, covering his mouth with one gloved hand. It lasted only a second, but I noticed the fatigue in his expression afterward. His normally steady posture seemed just a little heavier than before. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked. "I am fine," he answered almost automatically. The response came too quickly. I remembered the freezing stranger who had barely been able to keep his eyes open on my couch, and I recognized the same quiet determination now. "You are not convincing," I said. "When was the last time you actually rested?" He gave a small laugh that carried more exhaustion than humor. "I honestly do not remember." The answer surprised me more than anything else he had said since we met. Around us, his team remained respectfully distant, pretending to study the parking lot while clearly giving us privacy. I noticed how every person watched Damien carefully without staring directly at him, as though they all shared the same silent concern. "Have you eaten today?" I asked. He hesitated again. That hesitation told me everything. "Coffee does not count," I added before he could answer. For the first time since our paths crossed, he looked almost embarrassed. "No," he admitted quietly. "It does not." I shook my head. "There is a diner 2 exits from here that serves the best chicken soup in the county. You are coming with me." One of the men standing near the nearest sport utility vehicle instinctively stepped forward, but Damien raised a single hand. The man immediately stopped. Damien looked back at me with genuine curiosity. "You are inviting me to lunch after I just told you someone has been asking questions about you?" I am inviting a man who clearly forgot that people cannot carry the weight of an entire world on an empty stomach. He studied me for several silent seconds before nodding once. We sat in a quiet corner booth where nobody seemed to recognize him. He removed his heavy coat, and I finally noticed the full extent of the intricate tattoos stretching across his neck and disappearing beneath the sleeves of his shirt. They framed old scars that had long since healed, reminders of years I knew nothing about. Yet what caught my attention was not the ink or the scars. It was the weariness behind his green eyes. He thanked the waitress with sincere kindness, remembered her name after hearing it once, and asked about the homemade pie she recommended as though he had all the time in the world. The powerful man whose arrival had once filled an entire road with black vehicles now quietly stirred a bowl of soup while steam rose between us. "Everyone thinks strength means never slowing down," I said softly. "Sometimes strength is trusting someone else to watch the door while you finally sit down." Damien rested his spoon on the edge of the bowl and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not gratitude alone. It was relief. In that ordinary little diner, surrounded by the smell of fresh bread and hot coffee, I realized that beneath the tailored suits, the endless responsibility, and the tattoos covering his skin was a man who had spent so many years protecting everyone else that he had quietly forgotten how to let anyone protect him. The waitress smiled as she refilled our coffee cups before quietly leaving us alone again. Outside, snow continued to drift across the parking lot, softening the world beyond the diner windows until everything looked peaceful. Inside, however, I felt as though I had stepped into a conversation that neither of us had expected to have. Damien rested both hands around his coffee mug without drinking from it. For a long moment, he simply watched the steam rise into the air. "Do you know what people usually ask me?" he finally said. I shook my head. "They ask how I built my company. They ask about investments, security, influence, and success. Nobody has asked whether I ate lunch in years." His quiet laugh faded almost as soon as it appeared. "You asked before you asked anything else." I smiled. "My grandmother believed that hungry people should eat before they solve problems." He lowered his eyes for a moment, turning the cup slowly between his fingers. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Silence settled comfortably between us. It did not feel awkward. It felt honest. For the first time since meeting Damien, I was no longer looking at the man everyone else seemed to fear or admire. I was looking at someone who carried responsibility so constantly that he had forgotten how ordinary life was supposed to feel. After a few minutes, he reached into his coat pocket and carefully placed the black ring on the table between us. The polished surface reflected the warm light above our booth. My father gave me this the day before he passed away, he said softly. He told me something I did not understand until recently. He said that power can open doors, but only kindness invites people inside. His thumb rested lightly against the ring before he continued. For years I believed protecting everyone meant becoming impossible to reach. The stronger I became, the farther away ordinary life seemed. Then one winter night a woman opened her front door without asking who I was. I felt my cheeks grow warm and looked down at my untouched slice of apple pie. Anyone would have done the same. He smiled gently and shook his head. No, Emily. Many people would have called someone else. Many people would have driven away because it was safer. You stayed. I searched for the right words, but found none. Instead, I asked the question that had quietly followed me for weeks. Why did you really come back that morning? Damien leaned back slightly, his green eyes meeting mine with complete sincerity. Because gratitude delayed becomes gratitude forgotten. I promised myself long ago that if someone ever showed me kindness with no expectation of reward, I would never allow that moment to disappear without honoring it. I looked through the diner window at the fresh snow covering the quiet road. You have already done more than enough. The library is safe. My mother's therapy is covered. You have helped people you have never even met. He nodded slowly. Those were easy problems to solve. I looked back at him, confused. What is the difficult one? His expression softened in a way I had never seen before. Learning that not every answer comes from writing a check or making a phone call. He paused before speaking again. When I sat beside your fireplace that night, I slept peacefully for the first time in years. Not because your house was large. It was not. Not because it was luxurious. It was not. I slept because for a few hours nobody expected anything from me except to rest. His words settled quietly between us. I realized then that the little farmhouse I had always considered ordinary had given him something no amount of influence had ever purchased. A place where he could simply exist without carrying the weight of everyone else. As we prepared to leave, the waitress returned with the bill, but before I could reach for my wallet, she smiled knowingly and placed the receipt beside me. Written across the bottom were 4 simple words. Already taken care of. I looked at Damien, expecting another quiet gesture of generosity, but he gently slid the receipt back toward me. Not this time, he said with genuine surprise. The waitress laughed softly. The elderly couple by the window asked me to tell you both that it is nice to see people taking care of each other. We both turned toward the corner booth, but the couple had already gone, leaving only 2 empty coffee cups behind. Damien watched the empty seats for several thoughtful seconds before smiling to himself. Maybe the world still has more kindness than I remembered. As we stepped outside into the crisp winter air, I realized that neither of us had changed the other's life with grand speeches or impossible promises. We had simply reminded one another that even the strongest people sometimes need a warm meal, an open door, and someone willing to see the human being behind everything else. 1 year has passed since the night the snowstorm placed 2 strangers on the same road, and every winter morning still reminds me that the biggest changes in life rarely announce themselves with certainty. They arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary choices that seem too small to matter. The historic library still stands at the center of our town, its brick walls warmer than ever because children once again fill every reading room after school. New restoration workshops welcome volunteers from neighboring counties, and shelves that were once nearly empty now hold thousands of rescued books waiting for new readers. Nobody outside a very small circle knows who made that possible. The donation remains anonymous, just as Damien wanted. My mother completed her rehabilitation months ago, and now spends every Thursday reading stories to children in the library. She often tells them that every book deserves another chance because every person does too. Whenever she says those words, I quietly smile because I know someone who finally believed them about himself. Damien still carries responsibilities that most people could never imagine, but something about him has changed in ways no newspaper could ever report. He no longer measures every day by meetings, contracts, or endless schedules alone. At least once each week he drives to my farmhouse without a convoy, without flashing lights, and without anyone announcing his arrival. The first few times his security team protested, but eventually they understood that there was one place where Damien Moretti did not need to be surrounded by noise to feel protected. He arrives wearing simple clothes beneath a heavy winter jacket, his familiar tattoos still visible above the collar, carrying nothing more dramatic than groceries, fresh coffee beans, or another old novel he somehow discovers for me. We cook dinner together in my small kitchen, argue over whose recipe tastes better, laugh when the bread burns, and end every evening beside the same fireplace where a freezing stranger once opened his eyes for the first time. Sometimes we sit there without speaking at all because silence no longer feels empty. It feels earned. One evening I asked him whether he missed the enormous house where he had spent most of his life. He looked around my little living room with its mismatched furniture, handmade quilts, and stacks of repaired books before smiling in that quiet way I had come to recognize. A house can impress people, he said. A home lets you rest. Those words stayed with me long after the fire burned low. Spring eventually replaced the snow, then summer painted the fields green again. But Damien never forgot the lesson that began on the coldest night of winter. Neither did I. People still recognize him as a powerful businessman whose decisions affect countless lives. They admire his discipline, his confidence, and his ability to solve impossible problems. I admire something much simpler. I admire the man who now remembers to eat lunch, who calls his employees by name, who takes one afternoon each month to visit the children's reading program without cameras or announcements, and who never leaves my porch without making sure the bird feeder is full because he knows my grandmother believed even the smallest creatures deserve kindness. Looking back now, I realize that I never rescued Damien from the cold. The fire in my living room lasted only one night. What truly changed him was discovering that there was still one place in the world where he did not have to earn compassion through success, influence, or accomplishment. And he changed me as well. He taught me that quiet kindness is never insignificant, even when the person receiving it carries responsibilities far beyond our understanding. Every life we touch continues far beyond the moment we choose to help. Sometimes the smallest act becomes someone else's turning point. Sometimes an open door becomes the beginning of a new future. And sometimes the greatest gift we can offer another human being is not wealth, power, or perfect answers. It is the simple courage to say, without asking for anything in return, "Come inside. You are safe here." Because in the end, people rarely remember the size of the house that welcomed them. They remember the warmth that waited behind the door.